talk a bit more about that cut in overseas aid and apparently breaking that commitment in the manifesto. Tom Newton-Dunn telling us, well, was there a loophole there? But certainly the circumstances changed very, very dramatically since that commitment was made. I wonder if that persuades Andrew Mitchell, Conservative MP for Sutton Coldfields, a former Chief Whip, but also former Development Secretary. Andrew, good evening.
Good evening, John.
And I take it pretty much as read, Andrew, you are unhappy with the cut in overseas aid. Are you then resigned to it taking place?
Well, I'm very supportive of the bulk of what Rishi announced in the House of Commons this afternoon, and I'm very sympathetic, too, that he is trying to manage the public accounts at an appallingly difficult time. So I should make clear that overall I'm very supportive. But in respect of what he has decided to do about the point 7, I am very disappointed, and I hope he will think again. And if necessary, I hope the House of Commons will assist him to think again.
Okay.
And, you mentioned earlier on in your report with your interview with Laura that charity begins at home. And, of course, it does begin at home, but it doesn't end there. And there's something about, the British and our values and the work we've been doing over the last 20 years, driving forward development, doing something about these appalling discrepancies of wealth and opportunity, which disfigure our world. And that's why I think it is shameful that for £4 billion, the Chancellor has decided to go back on the promise of point 7 and to reverse what was a very clear manifesto commitment within the last year when the general election took place. And, we've seen today a very good minister resign because I fear quite rightly she's drawn the conclusion that it simply isn't acceptable to do this.
Okay, well, that's a clear position, Andrew. And obviously note your point that you believe and hope the House of Commons helps the government make up its mind to think again about this, which is your subtle way of saying there's a possibility of the government being defeated. A rebellion on the Tory side, no doubt in concert with opposition MPs' votes that could possibly defeat the government on this issue. Is that a viable possibility, do you think?
Well, we'll have to see. But I think that...
But you're prepared to do that?
I certainly think that the government needs to be confronted about what it's done in breaking its promise. Remember that Parliament virtually unanimously passed a law which to take this out of politics and to say that it was part of Britain's DNA to really try and move the dial and make a difference to the dire poverty which I have described. And therefore, if the government is asking the House of Commons to give it permission to break that promise, I think they will need to legislate. And in the Act which was passed, which I had a hand in drawing up, the requirement to say if you're unable to reach the point 7 is not retrospective. You have to go and make it clear. You can't plan to break it. And it wasn't a sort of get-out-of-jail-free card for the government and for ministers. It was the start of a process by which Parliament would express its view if the government had failed to live up to the Act which Parliament had passed, which said that we would make this contribution.
Yeah, I mean, the UK, Andrew, is still high, very high, in the league table of international donors. Does that weigh with you at all?
Yes, it does, and I think we can be incredibly proud of that. But that sort of underlines to me the importance of not breaking your promise, and particularly a promise that is made to the poorest and most wretched people in the world. And, we and Germany lead in Europe. America is by far the largest donor, but that, of course, is a per-head calculation. And there are other countries, particularly in Scandinavia, which are part of the great effort that's going on at the moment to try and help. And to break our promise at the time of a pandemic, when we know very well that we won't conquer COVID here until we conquer it everywhere. It'll come back and bite us if it's not helped overseas. And, for me, it's sadness to see that Angela Merkel and the Germans are leading the campaign to try and make sure that the poor world gets access to vaccinations, because this is something which Britain should be leading. When we did the first replenishment on the Global Alliance for Vaccinations back in 2010, it meant that in that parliament, when David Cameron was Prime Minister, Britain was vaccinating a child every 2 seconds and saving the life of a child every 2 minutes from diseases which, thank goodness, our children don't now die from. And, it's a British leadership, and that leadership now, particularly with the dismantling and abolition of DFID, is in great jeopardy.
Let me just ask you to develop that point a little more. You frame your case largely as a moral argument, and I absolutely don't wish to belittle the force of a moral argument. But what else, or how else, would you put it in the scales against the material saving from the cut in spending that we're describing here? How might the the UK lose out as a consequence of this cut?
It's not just a moral argument, although I think wherever you stand, you can't dismiss the moral arguments. It's above all an argument about Britain's national self-interest. If we make the world a safer place and a more prosperous place over there, we too in Britain benefit from that prosperity and that safety. And if I give you one example, in Somalia not long ago, there were more British passport holders training in terrorist camps than there were in Afghanistan or Pakistan. And Britain, under David Cameron, made a real effort to try and do something to stop the ungoverned space and the space for terrorists and the deep, dire poverty and misery which particularly girls and women lived in Somalia. And we have actually made a bit of difference. Whisper it not too loudly, but Somalia is a better place today than it was back in 2012. And of course, by making Somalia less ungoverned and a better place, we don't have the people who I described there training in terrorist camps who wish us ill, and disorder and misery in Somalia that way can be exported onto the streets of Britain or of London or Birmingham. So, it's not just philanthropy. It's very much about our national interest. I would argue that every penny of this budget is spent or should be spent in pursuit of Britain's national interest as well.
Okay, Andrew, thank you. Andrew Mitchell there, former Conservative Development Secretary.